The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
You think you know Princess Diana, the people's princess, the fairy tale bride, the royal icon whose face is still on magazine covers nearly 3 decades after her death. But almost nobody remembers what actually happened to her money, her jewelry, her letters, and her legacy after that night in Paris. The truth isn't a hidden trust or a secret heir. It's something stranger. A will that named 2 women almost nobody talks about. A butler who ended up on trial for his life's freedom, and a decade-long argument over who really had the right to decide what Diana would have wanted. This is the real story of Diana's estate, and it's dramatic enough without inventing anything. Diana Frances Spencer was not born into the spotlight, but she wasn't born into nothing either. She grew up at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, surrounded by aristocratic tradition and unsettled by her parents' bitter divorce when she was a child. She was 20 years old, working as a kindergarten assistant when she began being courted by Prince Charles. She was quiet, young, and by her own later account, almost entirely unprepared for what came next. On July 29, 1981, she married Charles at St. Paul's Cathedral in front of a global television audience estimated at 750 million people. Her 25-foot train swept behind her like something out of a storybook, and for a moment the monarchy looked young and hopeful in a way it hadn't in decades. Behind the doors, it fell apart quickly. Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, which predated the marriage, never really ended. Diana later described sensing Camilla's presence in the marriage from the very beginning. She developed bulimia, which she would eventually discuss publicly as a response to feeling powerless and unheard within an institution built on emotional restraint. The cracks became public in 1992, when leaked recordings of intimate phone calls between Charles and Camilla, dubbed Camillagate, embarrassed the monarchy on a global stage. A formal separation was announced that same year. Then, in 1995, Diana did something no modern royal had done. She sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama and spoke, on camera, about her marriage, her mental health, and her belief that she would never be queen. It was less a confession than a declaration of independence. From there, she reinvented what royal visibility could mean. She danced with John Travolta at the White House. She befriended Elton John. She shook hands, without gloves, with AIDS patients at a time when public fear and misinformation about the disease were still widespread. She walked through active minefields in Angola in body armor, drawing global attention to a humanitarian crisis most politicians preferred to ignore. The palace, built on composure, had produced a woman who used vulnerability as her most effective tool. By the time her divorce was finalized in 1996, Diana was no longer simply a royal wife. She was arguably the most photographed humanitarian on Earth, and she knew that her influence didn't have to end with her royal title. So she started thinking, carefully, about what would happen to everything she owned once she was gone. Diana signed her last will on June 1, 1996, roughly a year before the car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris that ended her life on August 31, 1997. It wasn't a hurried, secretive document scrawled in the dead of night. It was a standard, carefully drafted legal will, later confirmed through the official probate process and reported on extensively by British newspapers once probate became public record, as UK wills typically do. Her estate was valued at roughly £21.5 million after the deduction of debts and inheritance tax, largely made up of her divorce settlement, jewelry, personal property, and investments. The will itself was fairly conventional in structure, though its contents still managed to surprise people. She left the bulk of her estate, after other bequests, to be split between her 2 sons, William and Harry, held in trust until they reached certain ages. Her sons wouldn't get full, unrestricted access to their inheritance immediately. The structure was designed so that trustees would manage the funds until the boys were mature enough, in the eyes of the law and Diana's advisors, to handle that kind of wealth responsibly. She also left a smaller portion, around £50,000, to each of her 17 godchildren, and £50,000 to her personal assistant at the time, Paul Burrell. She left instructions for her personal jewelry, clothing, and other belongings, indicating that many of these would eventually pass to her sons, and gave her executors discretion over distributing many of her personal effects, including gifts to friends and staff. This is where the widely circulated internet version of the story and the real one diverge most sharply. Diana did not name Paul Burrell as executor of her will. Paul Burrell was her butler, and by most accounts a genuinely close and trusted member of her household staff. But the legal executors and trustees of her estate were her mother, Frances Shan Kidd, and her elder sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale. These were the two people with actual legal authority over Diana's estate, to manage her assets, oversee the trusts for William and Harry, and make binding decisions about the distribution of her property. Burrell was never granted that authority. What he did have was physical custody of a huge volume of Diana's personal belongings, letters, and papers, largely because of his role in her household in the years before her death, and because he assisted the family in the immediate aftermath in sorting through her possessions at Kensington Palace. That distinction between legal executor and trusted keeper of personal items is small on paper and enormous in consequence. It's exactly the confusion that would eventually put Burrell in a courtroom. In January 2001, Paul Burrell was arrested and later charged with the theft of items belonging to Diana's estate, allegedly worth around £4.5 million, including clothing, photographs, and personal correspondence. Prosecutors argued he had taken these items for personal gain rather than safekeeping. The trial began at the Old Bailey in October 2002 and quickly became a global media event, dragging in details about Diana's private life, her relationships, and the inner workings of royal households. Burrell's defense was that he had never stolen anything. He claimed he had taken possession of certain items to protect them, and that Diana herself had told him she trusted him to look after her legacy. The case collapsed in November 2002, not because the jury acquitted him, but because the trial was halted after Queen Elizabeth II recalled, in a private conversation with the Prince of Wales, that Burrell had told her years earlier he was safeguarding some of Diana's belongings. That memory, once relayed to prosecutors, undermined the theft case, and it was dropped. Burrell was never convicted of any crime. Afterward, he wrote two memoirs, A Royal Duty in 2003 and The Way We Were in 2006, which disclosed private letters and details from Diana's life, drawing sharp criticism from the royal family, particularly Prince Charles, and from Diana's family, who felt her privacy and trust had been violated after her death. Burrell has continued in the years since to speak publicly and give media interviews about his time working for Diana, remaining one of the most persistent, if controversial, public voices associated with her legacy. The real story of Diana's estate isn't a covert political weapon. It's the far more human story of what a mother tries to leave behind for her children, and what an institution does with a legacy it can't fully control. William and Harry received their inheritances gradually, as structured by the trust, partial access at 25, and full access at 30. William turned 30 in 2012 and Harry in 2014, at which point each received his full share, reportedly worth several £1 million after decades of growth and management. Both princes have spoken, at different points, about how the trust shaped their understanding of financial independence and, in Harry's case, about the emotional complexity of receiving money tied so directly to his mother's death. Diana's charitable influence, meanwhile, extended well beyond anything written explicitly into her will. The Princess of Wales Memorial Fund was established shortly after her death to continue supporting causes she cared about, including HIV and AIDS charities, and it distributed millions of pounds before eventually winding down its independent operations. Her advocacy against landmines, especially her widely photographed walk through a minefield in Wombo, Angola, in January 1997, is often credited with helping build public and political momentum behind the Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel landmines, which was signed later that same year and has since been ratified by more than 160 countries. Her early, deliberately unguarded public contact with AIDS patients in the late 1980s, at a time when public fear around transmission was widespread and often based on misinformation, is widely credited by public health historians with helping shift attitudes in the UK and beyond about how people living with HIV should be treated. None of this required a secret fund or an underground conspiracy. It required a woman with genuine influence choosing, repeatedly and publicly, to use it. What is true, and doesn't need embellishing, is that Diana's estate and legacy became a genuine source of friction within the royal family for years. Charles's later marriage to Camilla Parker Bowles in 2005 was, for some observers, evidence of exactly the dynamic Diana had spent her life resisting. Burrell's memoirs opened old wounds and forced Diana's private struggles back into public view long after her death, against the wishes of both her family and the royal family. William has generally guarded his public statements about his mother carefully, channeling his grief into causes like the Diana Award and his own mental health advocacy. Harry, particularly since stepping back from royal duties in 2020 and in his 2023 memoir Spare, has spoken far more openly about the pain of growing up in the shadow of his mother's fame and death, and about his complicated feelings toward the institution she once challenged. There is no evidence of a hidden trust funding activism against the monarchy, and no credible basis for claims about secret files or dossiers tied to her will. What there is, instead, is a genuinely complicated inheritance, financial, emotional, and reputational, that her sons and the institution she married into are still, in different ways, working through nearly 30 years later. It would be easy to say the real version of this story is less exciting than the rumor. It isn't. A young woman who felt trapped by an institution built on silence wrote a legal document that quietly, deliberately protected her sons from being financially controlled the moment she was gone, while leaving room for people she trusted to make good faith decisions about the rest. That document became the center of a criminal trial, a pair of controversial memoirs, and decades of public fascination, not because of some conspiracy, but because Diana mattered enough, as a person and as a public figure, that even the ordinary business of estate planning became global news. Her actual legacy is not a shadow trust. It's the Ottawa Treaty. It's the shift in public attitudes toward people living with HIV. It's two grown men who inherited both a fortune and an enormously complicated public story, and who are each, in their own way, still figuring out what to do with it. That's not a twist ending. It's just the truth. And it turns out the truth was dramatic enough all along. If you learned something new about the real history behind Diana's will, let me know what surprised you most, and consider following for more accurately researched royal history.